The Sands Hotel, Las Vegas, October 1968, 3:30 in the morning. Behind the showroom, past the public spaces where tourists lose money and dreams, there exists a private dining room. No windows, no clocks. Time moves differently here. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the kind of cologne that costs more than most people's cars. Crystal tumblers sit untouched on a mahogany table that has witnessed handshake deals worth more than small countries' budgets. 6 men occupy leather chairs arranged around the table. They speak in whispers because when you control Las Vegas, you don't need volume to command attention. Frank Sinatra paces behind his chair. He cannot sit still. His movements are sharp, agitated, the energy of someone who needs this meeting to go well, who needs these men to approve, to accept, to include. "Dean's different," Frank says, his voice carrying across the room. "You gotta understand Dean. He's not like other guys." The figure at the head of the table says nothing, waits. Frank continues talking, filling silence he cannot tolerate. But he's smart. He understands business. He understands loyalty. The door opens without ceremony. Dean Martin enters 23 minutes late. His tuxedo jacket hangs open, bow tie undone and draped around his neck like an afterthought. He carries a highball glass, though no one saw him stop at the bar. He moves with the unhurried pace of a man walking through his own living room. "Gentlemen," Dean says, settling into the remaining chair. He doesn't apologize for his lateness, doesn't explain, simply arrives. The offer is presented simply, cleanly. Exclusive Las Vegas residency, guaranteed revenue, protection that extends far beyond Nevada state lines, partnership with the most powerful entertainment organization in America. Frank watches Dean's face, waiting for recognition, for gratitude, for the appropriate response to an honor of this magnitude. Dean listens without expression, nods once, takes a measured sip from his glass. "That's generous," he says finally, "but I'm busy." The words hang in the air like smoke. Frank stops pacing. The room goes absolutely quiet. To understand what happened in that room, you need to understand how Las Vegas operated in 1968. Entertainment wasn't simply business, it was diplomacy, conducted through music, laughter, and carefully orchestrated loyalty. Every major performer who worked the strip understood the arrangement, unspoken but absolute. You performed when requested. You attended the correct social functions. You demonstrated proper respect to the appropriate people. In exchange, you enjoyed protection, promotion, and profits that Hollywood studios couldn't match. The system functioned flawlessly because it was built on mutual dependence. Frank Sinatra needed these relationships more than he needed oxygen. Despite his fame, despite his talent, despite his influence in recording studios and movie sets, Frank craved acceptance from powerful men. When they suggested he adjust his social calendar, Frank adjusted it. When they recommended he reconsider certain business partnerships, Frank reconsidered them. This wasn't weakness. In Frank's world, this was survival. This was how you maintained relevance in an industry where relevance could disappear overnight. Sammy Davis Jr. understood the mathematics even more clearly. As a black entertainer in 1968 America, Sammy couldn't afford powerful enemies. When pressure came to modify his political statements, Sammy modified them. When advice arrived about which social circles to avoid, Sammy listened carefully and followed directions. Dean Martin had been part of this ecosystem for years. He understood the rules. He had benefited from the protection, the exclusive bookings, the financial arrangements that came with belonging. But somewhere along the way, Dean had stopped needing to belong. The men who controlled Las Vegas had built their authority on a simple principle. Everyone wants something: money, fame, security, acceptance. Everyone has pressure points. Everyone can be influenced through careful application of opportunity and consequence. But influence requires leverage, and leverage requires need. Which brings us back to that private dining room, to the moment Dean Martin said he was busy, to the silence that followed his words like an echo in an empty cathedral. Because in that silence, the most powerful men in Nevada were encountering something completely outside their experience. Someone who genuinely didn't want what they were offering. Frank Sinatra's voice cuts through the quiet. "Dean, come on. These gentlemen are offering you the opportunity of a lifetime." His tone carries frustration barely held in check. Frank doesn't understand what's happening. In his experience, these meetings follow a script: gratitude, negotiation, agreement, handshakes, celebration. Dean doesn't respond immediately. He studies his drink as if it contains something more interesting than the conversation surrounding him. "I appreciate that," Dean says finally, "but I'm busy." Frank's agitation becomes visible. He begins pacing again, his movements sharper now, more urgent. Busy with what, exactly? What could be more important than this? Dean looks up from his glass, meets Frank's eyes. Things. The word hangs between them like a challenge Frank doesn't know how to accept. This is the fundamental difference between Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. Frank's power comes from connection, from belonging, from being needed by important people and needing important people in return. Frank's entire identity is built on being indispensable to the right circles. Dean's power comes from disconnection, from not belonging, from not needing anyone to validate his worth or secure his future. Frank continues talking, his voice growing louder. "Dean, come on. You're not thinking clearly. You're not seeing the big picture here. These gentlemen control every major entertainment venue from here to Miami. You think you can just walk away from that?" Dean doesn't argue, doesn't defend his position, doesn't explain his reasoning. He simply disengages. "Frank," Dean says, quietly, "I understand what they're offering. I understand what it means, and I'm telling you I'm not interested." The words are delivered without heat, without confrontation, without the emotional investment that would give Frank something to argue against. Frank stares at his longtime friend and partner, searching for the leverage point that will bring Dean back into the conversation, back into compliance. He finds nothing, because Dean has already mentally left the room. The men at the table watch this exchange with growing unease. They've seen resistance before. They've handled defiance. They know how to deal with fear, anger, desperation, and greed. But indifference? Genuine, complete indifference? That's uncharted territory. The figure at the head of the table speaks for the first time since Dean arrived. His voice is calm, measured, carrying the weight of decades spent in rooms exactly like this one. "Mr. Martin, perhaps you don't fully understand the nature of our offer." Dean nods respectfully. "I understand it perfectly." "Then you understand the exclusivity involved, the protection, the guarantees." "I do." Another pause, longer this time. "And you still decline?" "I'm afraid so." The room falls silent again, but this silence feels different, heavier. The men around the table exchange glances that carry conversations worth of meaning. They are beginning to understand something that terrifies them more than any threat or confrontation could. They have nothing over Dean Martin. No leverage, no pressure point, no thing he wants badly enough to compromise for. In their experience, everyone can be reached. Everyone has a price, whether measured in money, opportunity, or fear. They've built careers understanding what people need and controlling access to those needs. But Dean doesn't need their money. He's made enough. He doesn't need their protection. He's never threatened anyone. He doesn't need their approval. He's comfortable with his own company. He doesn't fear their disapproval. He's been an outsider before. Frank Sinatra continues trying to salvage the situation. Dean, think about this. Think about what you're walking away from. The security, the connections, the future bookings. Dean stands up slowly, not dramatically, not with any theatrical flourish. He simply rises from his chair with the casual ease of someone who's finished his drink and ready to go home. "Frank," he says, "I've thought about it." He straightens his jacket, adjusts his cufflinks, small gestures that somehow carry enormous weight in the suffocating tension of the room. "Gentlemen," he says, nodding to each man around the table, "thank you for your time." Frank makes one final attempt. "Dean, don't do this. Don't walk away from this opportunity. You'll regret it." Dean pauses at the door, looks back at his longtime friend and partner. There's something in his expression that might be sadness, or pity, or simple recognition of an unbridgeable difference between two men who've known each other for decades. "Frank," he says quietly, "I've never regretted walking away from something I didn't want." He turns the door handle. The soft click of the latch disengaging sounds like a gunshot in the absolute silence of the room. Dean Martin walks out. The door closes behind him with barely a whisper. That whisper might be the most powerful sound ever heard in that room, because it's the sound of someone saying no to absolute authority and living to tell about it. The men around the table sit in stunned silence, not because they've been insulted or threatened or challenged, but because they've been made irrelevant. Frank Sinatra stares at the closed door, understanding with horrible clarity that his relationship with Dean Martin will never be the same, and more importantly, that his own position in this room has just become infinitely more precarious. If Dean Martin can walk away from this offer, what does that say about Frank's desperate need to accept it? The consequences of Dean Martin's refusal unfold slowly, quietly, without spectacle or drama. Calls stop being returned. Not all at once, not obviously, but gradually, Dean's phone rings less frequently with offers from certain venues, certain promoters, certain business associates. The Rat Pack continues performing together, but something fundamental has changed. An unspoken tension fills the spaces between jokes and songs. Frank becomes more demanding, more controlling, as if trying to compensate for Dean's independence by tightening his grip on everything else. Dean notices these changes without commenting on them. He continues working, recording, appearing on television, but always on his own terms now, always as a free agent rather than a part of a larger organization. Other entertainers watch this transformation with fascination and terror. Dean has achieved something they all claim to want: complete artistic and personal freedom. But freedom comes with isolation, and most performers would rather belong to something that controls them than stand entirely alone. The men who made that October offer never approach Dean again, not out of respect, out of recognition. They've learned something that night at the Sands that reshapes their understanding of power. There are people you cannot touch, not because they're too strong, but because they're too free. Dean's reputation in certain circles shifts from respected entertainer to something approaching myth. The man who said no to the most powerful organization in Las Vegas and suffered no consequences. These stories aren't entirely accurate. Dean didn't fight anyone, didn't expose anyone, didn't challenge anyone's authority. He simply declined to be part of their system. But in a world where everyone performed for someone else's approval, simply saying no was revolutionary. Frank Sinatra never forgives Dean for that October night, not because of what Dean did to the men in that room, but because of Dean's refusal revealed about his own desperate need to belong. The friendship doesn't end dramatically. It fades, like smoke clearing from a closed room. The question that haunted Frank Sinatra for years afterward was simple. Why could Dean do what no one else could do? Why couldn't Frank himself have walked away from that room? The answer lay in their fundamentally different relationships with loss. Frank Sinatra had never truly lost everything. His career had experienced ups and downs, but Frank had never faced the specific terror of complete irrelevance, of being genuinely forgotten, of having to start over from absolute zero. Dean Martin had been Dino Crescetti, a poor kid from Steubenville, Ohio, working steel mills and fighting in boxing rings for grocery money. He'd been nobody before he became somebody. And having been nobody once, he understood that being nobody again wouldn't kill him. This wasn't philosophy. This was lived experience. Sammy Davis Jr. couldn't have walked away from that room because Sammy's position in the entertainment world was too precarious. As a black performer in 1968, Sammy needed powerful allies more than he needed personal independence. Younger entertainers couldn't have walked away because they hadn't yet built the financial security and professional reputation that would allow them to survive being blacklisted. But Dean? Dean had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life. He'd established a reputation that existed independent of any single organization's approval. And most importantly, he'd already survived irrelevance once. The psychological freedom that came from having nothing left to prove, nothing left to lose, and nothing left to fear was something money couldn't buy and fame couldn't provide. You had to earn it through experience, through hardship, through the specific kind of education that comes from losing everything and discovering you're still alive on the other side. Dean Martin had graduated from that school years before he ever set foot in Las Vegas. Which is why, when the most powerful men in Nevada offered him everything most entertainers dreamed of, Dean could look them in the eye and honestly say he was busy. He wasn't lying, he wasn't posturing, he wasn't making a statement. He genuinely had better things to do with his time. Dean Martin continued performing until the late 1980s. He never spoke publicly about that October night at the Sands. When journalists asked about his business relationships in Las Vegas, he would smile and redirect the conversation to more interesting topics. His choice that evening didn't reform the entertainment industry, didn't expose corruption, didn't challenge the system that controlled Las Vegas entertainment. It didn't change anything except Dean himself. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. Real power doesn't announce itself, doesn't threaten, doesn't negotiate. It simply leaves. The men in that Sands dining room understood control through leverage, through need, through careful manipulation of fear and desire. But they encountered something that night they'd never seen before. Someone who operated outside their system, not through defiance, but through indifference. Indifference is the most dangerous force in any room because it cannot be reasoned with, threatened, or bought. You cannot negotiate with someone who doesn't want what you're offering. You cannot intimidate someone who isn't afraid of losing what they have. You cannot control someone who doesn't need your approval to feel complete. Dean Martin understood something that most people spend their entire lives trying to learn: the difference between wanting something and needing it. Frank Sinatra wanted the approval of powerful men and needed it to feel valuable. Dean Martin might have wanted their respect, but didn't need it to sleep peacefully at night. That difference between want and need is the difference between freedom and slavery, between power and dependency, between walking into any room in the world and walking out of any room in the world. Dean Martin walked out of that room and into Las Vegas folklore, not because he fought anyone, but because he refused to fight at all. He chose absence over presence, silence over noise, independence over belonging. And in making that choice, he demonstrated the only kind of power that truly matters: the power to say no, and mean it. The door closed softly behind him that October night. The sound of that closing door echoed through Las Vegas entertainment politics for decades. It was the sound of someone walking away. And in a world built on the assumption that no one ever walks away from absolute power, that sound was revolution enough.